Every morning I woke up with the feeling that my life was passing me by, like a train I'd never catch. My alarm screamed at 6:30, tearing through the fragile fabric of dreams where I stood on a stage under dazzling spotlights, and the audience applauded so loudly it seemed the whole world trembled with delight. But reality was merciless. A tiny room in a communal apartment where the wallpaper peeled from the walls like skin from a burnt body. An old mattress that creaked with every movement, and the smell of dampness so deeply ingrained in my lungs that sometimes I felt as if I was breathing graveyard dirt. I quickly got ready and went to work at the Semyonich's grocery store, where I spent 8 hours scanning barcodes and giving change to people who looked at me as if I were part of the cash register, an inanimate object necessary to complete a purchase. The store was located in an old part of the city, where the houses seemed weary with age, and the streets were narrow, as if the city was shrinking in on itself from shame. The store building itself had once been beautiful. You could see it in the remnants of stucco under layers of peeling paint. But now it looked like a horror movie set. Inside, it smelled of something sour and stale. Fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting a sickly glow on the shelves of goods. Semyonich, the owner, was a man in his 60s, his face furrowed with wrinkles like old leather. He rarely spoke to me, only grunted when I reported the earnings, and his small eyes always seemed suspicious, as if he expected me to steal something. The customers were as gray and faceless as the district itself. Old women in faded headscarves, men with tired faces, children who eyed the candies hungrily but knew their parents wouldn't buy them sweets. My real life began after work, when I returned home and locked myself in my room. I had an old mirror with a crack down the middle left behind by the previous tenant, and it was in front of it that I spent hours rehearsing. I imagined myself an actor, trying out different roles, talking to an imaginary audience, studying my movements and expressions. The crack in the mirror split my reflection in two, and sometimes it seemed as if I was looking at two different people. One who worked as a cashier and was slowly dying from routine, and another who dreamed of fame and recognition. In those moments I felt alive, as if electricity coursed through my veins, and I forgot about the damp-smelling room, about grumpy Semyonich, and about the endless stream of customers. I became someone else, someone important, someone people would remember. My communal apartment neighbors considered me strange. Olga Petrovna, a pensioner who lived in the next room, often knocked on the wall when I rehearsed too loudly. She said I talked to myself like a madman, but I didn't care. Vasily, a middle-aged alcoholic who occupied the room across the hall, sometimes eavesdropped at my door and then laughed, telling other neighbors about the failed actor. But I paid no attention to their ridicule. I had a dream, and it was the only thing that kept me from complete despair. Every night I went to bed thinking that tomorrow, perhaps, something would happen that would change my life forever. That winter was particularly harsh. Snow fell for weeks, turning the city into a white desert, and the cold seeped into homes through cracks in windows and walls. The heating in the store barely worked, and I spent the whole day shivering, my fingers numb as I counted money or scanned items. Customers came bundled in scarves and hats, their faces red from the frost, and they hurried to finish their purchases and return to the warmth. I envied them. They had a home to return to, families waiting with hot dinners. I had only a cold room and dreams that seemed to grow more distant with each passing day. One particularly gloomy February day, when the snow was falling so heavily you could barely see through the store windows, I noticed an advertisement pasted to a pole near the bus stop. Usually I paid no attention to such things. The city was plastered with ads for jobs, services, lost cats. But something about this flyer caught my eye. Maybe it was the bright red color of the paper standing out against the gray February day, or the unusual font used for the text. I walked closer and read, "Circus Wonderland announces open auditions for performers, seeking individuals with unusual talents and a willingness to experiment. High pay guaranteed." Apply at Promyshlenaya Street 13 from 6:01 p.m. to 8:00 p.m. My heart pounded faster. A circus. It's not theater, not cinema, but it's still a stage, an audience, a chance to show oneself. I had never considered a circus as a career, but now, standing in the falling snow and reading this announcement, I felt something akin to hope. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe fate had finally decided to give me a chance. I carefully peeled the advertisement from the pole and slipped it into my jacket pocket, feeling the paper rustle under my fingers. The rest of the day I thought only of this advertisement, imagining myself in a bright costume under the big top, hearing the imaginary applause of the audience. In the evening, back home, I took out the announcement and examined it carefully by the light of my desk lamp. The address was unfamiliar to me. Promyshlenaya Street was in the old part of the city, where factories and plants used to be located, most of them now deserted. I didn't know what kind of circus could be there, but I decided that tomorrow after work I would definitely go. All night I couldn't sleep, planning what I would say at the interview, what skills I would demonstrate. I had no circus training, but I was good at declamation, I had good plasticity, and I was ready to learn whatever was required. The next day at the store dragged on endlessly. Every time I looked at the clock, it seemed as if time had stopped. Semyonich noticed my distraction and reprimanded me several times, but I didn't care. My thoughts were consumed by the upcoming interview, and I mentally rehearsed my speech. The customers seemed even grayer and more faceless than usual, as if they were ghosts from a past life that I was about to leave behind. When it was finally time to close the store, I quickly counted the earnings, handed the keys to Semyonich, and hurried to the bus stop. The bus to Promyshlenaya Street took almost an hour, traversing the entire city. I sat by the window, watching the landscape change outside. First residential areas, then shopping centers, then vacant lots and abandoned buildings. Promyshlenaya Street turned out to be even more desolate than I had expected. Old brick buildings stood like gravestones. Many windows were boarded up, and those that remained open gaped as black voids. The snow here lay longer and was dirtier, mixed with industrial dust and soot. I walked along the street searching for house number 13 and felt my confidence gradually slipping away. House number 13 turned out to be the gloomiest building on the entire street. It was an old factory, its brick walls blackened by time and industrial emissions. The tall windows of the first floor were boarded up with metal sheets on which someone had scratched strange symbols like runes or ancient writings. The massive iron door was covered in rust, but above it a dim red light glowed, casting a bloody reflection on the snow at the threshold. I stood there for several minutes, fighting the urge to turn around and go back. A cold wind pierced my jacket, and I felt goosebumps prickle my skin. Not just from the cold, but from some inexplicable fear. Something about this place was wrong, as if the building itself exuded malevolence or concealed something dreadful. But the dream of the stage and the audience was stronger than my fear. I pushed the heavy iron handle, and the door opened with a prolonged creak that echoed down the dark corridor. Inside, it smelled of dampness, machine oil, and something else. A sweetish, nauseating odor that reminded me of the funeral home where I had once attended the wake of a distant relative. The corridor was narrow and long, lit by sparse bulbs that swayed in the draft, casting dancing shadows on the peeling walls. My footsteps echoed hollowly in the emptiness, and it seemed as if someone was walking behind me, mirroring my every move. I turned around several times, but the corridor behind me was empty, only shadows gliding along the walls like living things. At the end of the corridor, I saw another door with a sign that read Administration. Light under the door indicated someone was inside, and I knocked, trying to inject a confidence into my rap that I didn't truly feel. The door was opened by a tall, thin man in a black suit that seemed too large for his scrawny frame. His face was pale, almost white, with sharp features and deeply set eyes that looked at me with an unhealthy curiosity. His lips stretched into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes and looked more like the baring of a predator's teeth spotting prey. He introduced himself as Mr. Marcus, the circus director, and invited me in with a gesture of his long hand, its fingers unusually extended. The director's office was a strange place, incongruous with the building's exterior. The walls were upholstered in dark red velvet, and antique furniture and old portraits of people in circus costumes were everywhere. But something about these portraits was wrong. The faces seemed distorted by pain or fear, and their eyes seemed to follow my every move. On a massive wooden table lay strange objects, old medical instruments that gleamed in the light of the desk lamp, glass jars with some murky liquid in which unidentifiable objects floated, and thick leather-bound tomes with worn spines. The air in the room was heavy and stuffy, permeated with the scent of old leather, chemicals, and that same sweetish aroma I had noticed in the corridor. Marcus gestured me to a chair in front of the desk, and he sat opposite, hands clasped, studying me with a gaze that made me feel like a laboratory animal. His voice was quiet and soft, but there were undertones that sent shivers down my spine. He began to ask questions, and with each subsequent question it became clearer that this interview was unlike any I had heard of before. First, he asked about my experience, and I told him about my home rehearsals in front of the mirror, about my dreams of becoming an actor. Marcus nodded and wrote something in a large notebook, but his gaze never left my face, as if he was examining every wrinkle, every muscle movement. Then the questions grew strange. He asked if I was afraid of pain, if I was willing to sacrifice a part of myself for art, how I felt about physical alterations. When I asked him to clarify what he meant, Marcus just smiled enigmatically and said that true art required sacrifices, that great artists were always willing to transform for their calling. His words sounded like philosophy, but something in his tone made me think of something far more concrete and frightening. He asked about my family, if there were people who would look for me if I disappeared. I answered honestly that I had practically no family, that my communal apartment neighbors would hardly notice my absence, and Semyonich would easily find a new cashier. The last question was the strangest of all. Marcus leaned across the table towards me, and I felt his breath, cold and smelling of something metallic. He asked if I believed in fate, if I thought some people were born to entertain others, even if that entertainment was based on their suffering. The question was so unexpected and terrifying that I didn't know what to say. I mumbled something about art indeed requiring sacrifices, that actors must be able to portray human emotions, including pain and suffering. Marcus nodded with satisfaction, as if I had given exactly the answer he wanted to hear. After that, he stood up and went to one of the cupboards, taking out a contract. The document was written in an old-fashioned script on yellowed paper, and many clauses were so vaguely worded that I couldn't understand their precise meaning. Marcus explained that the circus provided housing, food, and good pay, but in return demanded complete dedication to the cause and willingness to fulfill any demands of the management. He emphasized that the circus was not just a job, but a way of life, that artists lived there permanently and rarely left the premises. This seemed strange to me, but I thought that perhaps all circuses were like this, closed communities of people dedicated to art. When I signed the contract, Marcus said I could start work tomorrow, that I would be given a room in the residential wing of the building and shown where rehearsals took place. He escorted me to the exit, and on the way I noticed that there were several other doors in the building behind which strange sounds could be heard. Something like crying or moaning or some kind of mechanical noises. When I asked about this, Marcus explained that these were the sounds of rehearsals, that the circus artists took their work very seriously and trained even late in the evening. His explanation sounded reasonable, but something about those sounds made my blood run cold. The next day, I quit my job at the store. Semyonich showed neither surprise nor regret. He simply nodded and said he would transfer my salary to my card. I gathered my few belongings, said goodbye to my communal apartment neighbors, who reacted to my departure with indifference, and headed to Promyshlenaya Street. This time, the circus building didn't seem so gloomy, perhaps because now it was my home, my future. Marcus met me at the entrance and led me to the residential part of the building, which turned out to be more modern and comfortable than I had expected. My room was small but cozy, with a bed, a wardrobe, a table, and even its own shower. The window overlooked the courtyard, where I saw several vans and some structures covered with tarpaulins. Marcus explained that this was equipment for performances that the circus often toured small towns. He gave me a uniform, black trousers, a white shirt, and a red vest, and said that my training would begin tomorrow. Initially, I would work as a general assistant, helping prepare props and learning the basics of circus art. And when I showed my abilities, I would be able to perform for the public. That evening, I went to bed feeling that my life was finally beginning to change for the better. But my sleep was restless, full of strange images and sounds. I dreamed of the faces from the portraits in Marcus's office, coming to life and trying to say something, but instead of words, blood poured from their mouths. I saw myself on stage, but the audience laughed at me not with delight, but with cruelty, and their faces were distorted with malice. Several times I woke up to strange sounds coming from other parts of the building, but when I listened closely, silence fell, broken only by the howling wind outside the window. In the morning, I was woken by a knock on the door. Standing there was a middle-aged woman in a sparkly circus costume. She introduced herself as Rose, the artist coordinator, but something about her appearance was wrong. The left half of her face was covered in strange scars that formed some kind of pattern, and her right eye was a different color than her left. She spoke quickly and nervously, constantly looking around as if afraid someone was listening. Rose led me to the training hall, where I saw the other circus artists for the first time. What I saw shook me to the core. The people training in the hall didn't look like ordinary circus performers. One man had a metal prosthesis with some mechanisms instead of a left arm. A female acrobat's legs were unnaturally long, as if they had been specially stretched. And a clown's face was covered in scars that created a permanent grimace of horror. All of them moved strangely, unnaturally, as if their bodies didn't entirely belong to them. When they noticed me, their gazes were filled with a kind of hopelessness, but no one spoke to me. They all continued their exercises in complete silence. Rose explained that every artist in the circus was unique, that the audience came to see people who were different from ordinary ones. She said that in time, I too would find my peculiarity, my zest, that would make me unforgettable to the audience. Her words sounded encouraging, but something in the tone in which she said it, and in the way she looked at the other artists, made me think that by peculiarity, she meant something entirely different. For the first few days, I did simple work, cleaning the arena, moving props, helping prepare costumes. Marcus sometimes observed me from afar, writing something in his notebook, and his gaze made my skin crawl. A week later, my job changed. Rose said it was time to move to the next stage and led me to a basement room she called the Transformation Chamber. As I descended the narrow stone staircase lit by sparse bulbs, I felt the air grow heavier and more stifling. The basement walls were covered in moisture that seeped from cracks in the brickwork, and the floor was covered with old mats soaked in an unpleasant smell. In the corners stood metal tables with straps that reminded me of operating or torture tables. And on shelves along the walls were glass jars containing various instruments floating in cloudy liquid. Some of these instruments I couldn't identify, but they looked ancient and terrifying, as if they belonged to some forgotten medical practice. Rose noticed my fright and hastened to explain that this was where artists prepared for performances, where they learned to overcome their physical limitations. She showed me several stretching and flexibility exercises that truly seemed like ordinary circus training, but her eyes constantly darted towards the metal tables and instruments as if she was hiding their true purpose. During the training, I heard sounds from the next room, muffled screams and some mechanical noises like medical equipment operating. When I asked about it, Rose said it was other artists undergoing advanced training and quickly changed the subject. My first performances began 2 weeks after joining the circus. I was assigned as an illusionist's assistant, an elderly man named August, whose face was covered in strange tattoos that seemed alive in the spotlight. August barely spoke, only showed me what to do, where to stand, how to hand him props. His hands were covered in scars and his fingers moved unnaturally as if some joints had been replaced with metal prostheses. When I asked about his injuries, he merely gave a grim chuckle and uttered a single phrase that haunted me for many nights afterward. Art demands sacrifice, boy, and here everyone pays their price. The circus audience was not what I had imagined. These weren't families with children looking for entertainment, but rather strange people with an unhealthy gleam in their eyes who reacted to the performance too emotionally. They applauded not the artist's skill, but their deformities and suffering. When the acrobat with unnaturally long legs performed her act, I saw the spectators lean forward, studying the deformation of her body, and when she fell and writhed in pain, they laughed and whistled. The clown with the scarred face told not funny jokes, but grim stories of pain and humiliation, and the audience gasped in admiration at every cruel detail. I realized I hadn't joined an ordinary circus, but some perverted show where human suffering was turned into entertainment. After each performance, the artists dispersed to their rooms, not speaking to each other, as if ashamed of what had just happened in the arena. I tried to talk to some of them, but received only monosyllabic answers or was simply ignored. The only exception was a young girl named Lily, who worked as an aerialist. Her left arm had been amputated above the elbow, and she performed, demonstrating how she could execute complex tricks with one arm. But something in her movements told me that she wasn't born with this characteristic, that the arm had been removed relatively recently. One late evening, I met Lily in the corridor as she was returning from the training hall. Her face was pale and her eyes were red from tears. I asked if she was all right, and to my surprise, she stopped and looked at me with such desperate hope, as if she had seen a life raft in a raging sea. She looked around, made sure we were alone, and whispered a few words that completely overturned my understanding of what was happening. "They're not artists. They're victims, and soon you'll be one of them too." Before I could ask any questions, she quickly left, leaving me standing in the empty corridor with icy dread in my chest. The next few days I spent in tense anticipation, trying to understand what Lily meant. I began to observe what was happening in the circus more closely, noticing details that had previously escaped my attention. I saw some artists disappear for several days, and when they returned, they had new scars, deformities, or prostheses. I noticed that there were rooms in the building where artists were taken against their will, and from there came sounds that could not be mistaken for anything else, the sounds of medical procedures performed without anesthesia. Marcus and his assistants were constantly planning something, whispering in corners, studying medical books, and taking notes while looking at the artists. I began to explore the building in my free time, when everyone else was asleep or busy with rehearsals. In the basement, I discovered several rooms whose existence I hadn't suspected before. In one of them stood actual medical equipment, operating tables, anesthesia machines, surgical instruments. On the walls hung anatomical diagrams, but not ordinary ones, rather modified ones showing how the human body could be altered to create various deformities. In the corner stood refrigeration units, and I didn't dare look inside them, fearing to see what would finally shatter my psyche. In another room, I found an archive, folders with documents for each circus artist. My hands trembled as I opened these folders and read the entries. These were medical records, but not ordinary ones, but detailed plans on how to alter a person's body to turn them into a circus freak. Lily's folder contained before and after photos of her amputation, a detailed description of the operation, and notes on how her psychological state affected the quality of her performances. The clown's folder contained diagrams of how the scars were applied to his face to create a permanent grimace of horror. Each artist had their own story of transformation from an ordinary person into a circus monstrosity. The most horrifying discovery was the folder with my name on it. It already existed, even though I had only been working at the circus for a few weeks. It contained my photos taken secretly, medical evaluations based on observations, and a detailed plan for my improvement. According to this plan, I was to lose both legs above the knee and receive special prostheses that would allow me to move only by crawling like a human snake. The dates of the operations were indicated, methods of suppressing resistance, and prognoses regarding how long I would be able to perform in such a condition. At the end of the document was Marcus's signature and the seal of some medical organization. I felt the world crumbling around me. All my dreams of the stage and recognition had turned into a nightmare in which I became the prey of sadists, transforming people into freaks for the entertainment of a perverted audience. I thought about escaping, but knew it wouldn't be easy. The circus building was isolated, located in an industrial zone where there was no one at night. Furthermore, I had signed a contract, which I now understood was not an employment agreement, but consent to be transformed into a circus monster. Perhaps this document even had legal force, and if I tried to contact the police, I would simply be returned. The following days, I lived in constant fear, waiting for them to come for me. Every knock on the door made my heart pound wildly. Every glance from Marcus seemed to be studying me, as if he was choosing the right moment to begin my transformation. I tried to act normal, do my job, participate in performances, but panic grew within me. Sleep abandoned me, food tasted bland, and each day stretched like an eternity. I saw other artists look at me with pity, knowing my time was coming to an end, but no one dared to help or even openly warn me. One night, as I lay sleepless, pondering escape methods, Rose entered my room. She wasn't alone. She was accompanied by two men in white coats whom I hadn't seen before. Their faces were hidden by medical masks, but their eyes glowed with an unhealthy excitement. Rose said it was time for my special training, that tomorrow I would have a special performance for which some improvements were needed. I tried to resist, to scream, to call for help, but one of the men took out a syringe with some liquid, and I felt the sharp needle enter my neck. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was Rose's laughter and the words of one of the medics. "This specimen will be particularly interesting to the audience. A human snake is always popular." Darkness engulfed me, but even in an unconscious state, I continued to hear sounds. The clinking of metal instruments, the hum of medical equipment, and the distant music of the circus, playing for a performance where I was to become the main attraction. My dreams of the stage were finally coming true, but not at all as I had imagined. When I woke up, I immediately knew something had changed. I was lying on a hard table in that same basement room I had seen before, but now it was brightly lit by medical lamps. My body was partially covered by a sheet, but I felt that some changes had occurred beneath it. Trying to move, I found that I couldn't control the lower part of my body, not because it was bound, but because it simply wasn't there. The sheet concealed the place where my legs had once been, and now in their place was something else, something unnatural and alien. Marcus stood beside the table, examining his work with the professional satisfaction of a surgeon. His hands were bloody, and a smile played on his face that was both triumphant and insane. He noticed I had regained consciousness and leaned over me, his breath hot and smelling of chemicals. He told me that the operation had been successful, that I had now become a true circus artist, unique and unforgettable. He explained that my legs had been replaced by a special mechanism that would allow me to move in snake-like motions, that the audience would be thrilled by such a performance. I tried to scream, but only rasps escaped my throat. Apparently, my larynx had been damaged during the operation, or some drugs had been administered to suppress the ability to speak. Marcus saw my attempts and laughed, saying that I wouldn't need my voice anymore, that a human snake should hiss, not speak. He showed me a mirror, and what I saw in the reflection made my soul die completely. My face was disfigured, my skin was stretched and covered with artificial scales, my eyes had become narrow and serpentine, and my tongue had been surgically split. I was no longer human. I had become a monster, created for the entertainment of sadists. The following weeks became a prolonged hell for me. Marcus and his assistants didn't just disfigure my body, they methodically destroyed my humanity, turning me into the perfect circus monster. Each day brought new procedures, new alterations, new humiliations. My skin was treated with special chemicals that made it increasingly resemble snake scales, greenish and repulsive to the touch. Injections of some drugs altered my metabolism so that I could go without food for weeks, entering a state similar to reptilian hibernation. My eyes were surgically altered, my eyelids became almost imperceptible, and my pupils took on a vertical shape like those of real snakes. But the most terrifying aspect was not the physical change, but the psychological impact I was subjected to. I was forced to lie for hours in a special chamber where sounds of hissing and crawling were played until these sounds seemed natural, native to me. I was injected with drugs that suppressed human emotions and enhanced animal instincts. Gradually, I began to lose the ability to think in complex categories. My thoughts became primitive, focused on basic needs: food, warmth, survival. Memories of my past life, of dreams of becoming an actor, of my home and work in the store became increasingly hazy, as if they belonged not to me but to someone else. Rose was now my trainer, and she approached her work with professional sadism. She taught me movements characteristic of snakes, how to crawl, writhing my whole body, how to raise my head and sway from side to side, how to hiss and flick my forked tongue. Every mistake was punished with electric shocks. Every manifestation of human behavior was suppressed by pain and humiliation. She forced me to eat raw meat that she threw on the floor, training me to take food only with my mouth, without the use of my hands. My hands had been surgically deformed, my fingers fused and covered with the same scales as the rest of my body, transforming into fin-like appendages that were practically useless for manipulating objects. My first performances in my new guise became the culmination of my nightmare. The circus arena was filled with the same perverted audience as before, but now their ecstatic shouts and applause were for me. I was brought out in a special cage like a wild beast, and then released into the arena where I had to crawl before the spectators, demonstrating my serpentine nature. The audience shrieked with delight when I raised my head and hissed. Children pointed at me and laughed, and adults placed bets on how long I could go without food or how I would react to various stimuli. The most humiliating thing was that a part of me, deeply hidden within my disfigured body, still remembered human dignity. That part screamed in horror every time I performed my act, every time the audience applauded my deformity. But these screams grew fainter, and my human consciousness gradually dissolved into the animal nature forced upon me. The drugs, constant training, and psychological manipulation did their work. I began to forget that I had once been human. Sometimes at night, lying in my cage, I tried to remember my real name, the faces of people from my past, but these memories slipped away like smoke. A few months later, another artist was placed in my cage. A young man recently transformed into something akin to a Spider-Man. His limbs were elongated and deformed, and mechanical legs were attached to his back, moving from nervous impulses. In his eyes, I saw the same horror and despair I had once experienced, and this awakened the remnants of human feelings within me. I tried to communicate with him, but only hissing sounds escaped my throat, frightening him even more. He looked at me not as a person, but as a monster, and I realized that my true essence was reflected in his eyes. I had truly become what they had made me. The circus often moved from place to place, and I saw dozens of cities through the bars of my cage. Everywhere we were met the same way, with unhealthy curiosity and sadistic delight. The audience in different cities was practically identical. People who found pleasure in the suffering of others, who saw us not as victims but as entertainment. I understood that we were part of a vast industry of human degradation, that there were many such circuses, and every day, somewhere in the world, new victims appeared, new artists who went through the same hell as I did. One day, during a performance in a small provincial town, an event occurred that finally broke the last remnants of my human will. Among the spectators, I saw Semyonich, my former employer from the store. He sat in the front row and watched my performance with interest, not recognizing his former cashier in me. As I approached the edge of the arena, he even reached out to stroke my scaly head like a pet. There was no recognition, no pity in his eyes, only amusement at the sight of a circus freak. The man who knew me as an employee, as an individual, now saw only exotic entertainment in me. After that incident, something inside me irrevocably broke. The remnants of human consciousness that still flickered deep within my mutilated mind extinguished forever. I stopped fighting, stopped trying to remember the past, stopped suffering from humiliations. I fully accepted my new nature, without reservation. When I was released into the arena, I felt no shame or disgust. I simply performed what I was created for. My movements became more natural, my hissing more convincing, and my gaze definitively lost all traces of human reason. Marcus was pleased with the result of his work. He often came to my cage, studying me as a scientist studies a successful experiment. He took notes on how complete the transformation was, how effectively human personality traits had been suppressed. Sometimes he brought other people with him, doctors, scientists, potential investors, and exhibited me as a sample of perfect work. They discussed the technical details of the procedure, the possibilities of commercial application of the method, plans for creating new types of circus freaks. For them, I was not a human, not a victim, but a commodity, proof of the effectiveness of their methods. Years passed, and I became an increasingly popular attraction. My fame as the human snake spread far beyond the circus, and people specifically traveled from other cities to see me. My image was printed on posters and promotional brochures. Newspapers wrote about me as a wonder of nature or a unique creation. No one questioned how I became this way. No one was interested in my past. I was just a circus monster, created for the entertainment of the crowd. Over time, my body began to deteriorate from constant chemical exposures and surgical interventions. The artificial scales began to peel. The prostheses that replaced my legs worked worse, and my vision deteriorated so much that I could barely distinguish shapes. Marcus and his team tried to prolong my career by performing new operations and administering new drugs, but my body could no longer cope with such an impact. I felt myself dying, but it caused me no fear or sadness, only the indifference of a creature that had long forgotten human emotions. One morning, waking up in my cage, I realized I could no longer move. My body had completely given out, and I lay motionless, barely breathing. Rose discovered me in this state and immediately called Marcus. They examined me, performed some tests, but it was clear that nothing could be done. My body was exhausted from years of abuse and experiments, and death was inevitable. Marcus merely shrugged and ordered a replacement to be prepared. A new candidate for the human snake role was already in the neighboring cage. A young man recently snatched from the street. The last days of my life passed in complete solitude. I was moved to a distant corner of the basement where other discarded exhibits were stored, the bodies of former artists who had not survived the transformation or had died from exhaustion. Here, among dead monsters who were once people with dreams and hopes, I awaited my end. Strangely, in these last hours, some human memories returned to me. Images from childhood, faces of forgotten friends, the feeling of sunlight on my skin. Perhaps the approach of death weakened the effect of the drugs that had suppressed my personality. I remembered the day I first saw the circus advertisement. Back then, it seemed like a chance to change my life, an opportunity to realize my dreams of the stage and recognition. How wrong I was. My dreams did come true, but in the most perverse form. I became a star, a celebrity spoken of and remembered. Only instead of talent and skill, people remembered my deformity. Instead of admiring art, they experienced morbid curiosity for human suffering. I got my share of fame, but at what cost? In the last moment, when my breathing grew very shallow and my heart barely beat, I tried to utter my real name, the one I bore before turning into a monster. But only a faint hiss escaped my throat, the last sound of the human snake. My real name was forgotten forever, as was everything that connected me to the human world. Death came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like liberation from a multi-year nightmare. The next day, my body was disposed of along with other remains, and a new human snake appeared in my place at the circus, young, fresh, ready to repeat my path of suffering. The circus continued to operate. The audience continued to be entertained, and somewhere in cities, new advertisements appeared for artists for unique circus performances. The wheel of human cruelty continued to turn, grinding new lives, turning dreams into nightmares and people into monsters. My story ended, but it was only one of thousands of similar stories. The world is full of people looking for their chance, their opportunity to step onto the stage and show themselves to the world. And among them, there will always be those who, like me once, will believe the beautiful words about art and fame, not suspecting what price will be paid for it. They will look in the mirror, rehearsing for an imaginary audience, dreaming of applause and recognition. And perhaps one day they too will see an advertisement for a circus, and their hearts will pound with hope and anticipation. But that will be another story, another tragedy, another life turned into a spectacle for sadists. And I became only a memory, a ghost, dissolved into the endless stream of human suffering turned into entertainment. My journey from a store cashier to a circus freak ended where it began, in the oblivion and indifference of a world that only knows how to consume the pain of others without questioning its origin.